said, I'm Meg Harrod. I'm with Copperhead Environmental Consulting, and I'm a wetland scientist for Copperhead. I got my bachelor's from the University of North Texas in ecology, and I got my master's, or I'm working on my master's at Texas State University in aquatic resources. So I spent about the past 4 years studying wetlands. My main interest is wetland plant invasions. And so I really enjoy my work with Copperhead because it allows me to get out in the field and be present with the wetlands and kind of observe patterns that I may not be able to see if I was working just researching in my office. So let's just start out with the basics of what is a wetland, and then more importantly, following that, why we should care about wetlands. So the Army Corps of Engineers defines wetlands as areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater. I always like to bring attention to groundwater because I think it's an easy one to forget, especially if you don't see it. So surface or groundwater, and that's at a frequency or duration that's sufficient enough to support, under typical circumstances, hydrophytic vegetation or vegetation that's adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. So if we break down this definition, we start to be able to pull out key components. And the first one is hydrology. So this very beginning of the definition, areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater, that's directly referring to our hydrology. So a lot of things influence our hydrology, things like topography, groundwater, and just the general area. And hydrology plays a key component in these next two parts of the definition. So the next part of this definition is saturated soil conditions. And hydrology directly affects how soils are going to develop, how they're going to change, and what we see in those soils when we look at them. So saturated soil conditions are a direct result of the wetland hydrology that we observe. And then finally, vegetation. So wetland vegetation is specifically adapted for these conditions. So for saturated soil conditions and for wetland hydrology, perhaps standing water, things of that nature. So if you think of this kind of like a pyramid where hydrology is that base that forms the conditions that allow for saturated soils to come about and for hydrophytic vegetation to grow, then you start to get this picture of how wetlands form and those key components that can inform us about wetland ecology. So hydrology, we're going to dig into these a little bit deeper. Hydrology is how long an area has been saturated or inundated with water. And again, this can either be surface water, things like runoff, or our groundwater. I like to think of hydrology as how water moves through a given area. So if you imagine yourself standing on the slope of a hill, you can see that there probably wouldn't be a wetland forming on a hill slope because the water is just going to run right down that hill. So topography is a major influence in our hydrology. But again, hydrology is this building block from which we can get information about our soils and our vegetation. So next we've got hydric soils. That's what we call soils that have been developed under saturated or flooded conditions. And hydric soils are really key because they provide a temporal element to our understanding of wetlands. If an area has just had a puddle in it for about a week, you're not necessarily going to see those hydric soil conditions that you see in areas that have been inundated with water for really long periods of time. So hydric soils really give us clues as to the length of time that that soil's been saturated and kind of the mechanism of saturation. And then finally, we've got hydrophytic vegetation. And again, this hydrophytic vegetation builds on those saturated or hydric soils. Hydrophytic vegetation is specifically adapted for wetland environments. or for saturated soil conditions. And you've probably experienced, with your house plants, if you overwater it, maybe they die or they start to show signs of stress. That's because those guys aren't necessarily adapted for these saturated soil conditions or for conditions where they're inundated with water. So wetland plants actually have these really cool adaptations that allow them to be successful in these wetland conditions. So if you take nothing else away from this presentation, I think this is probably the most important slide, and that's why we should care. And wetlands, I'm sure you've all seen over the course of the day that they offer so many ecosystem services, so many irreplaceable ecosystem services. And historically, wetlands have kind of gotten a bad rap. They don't always smell great. Sometimes you get your boots stuck in the mud. They also harbor mosquitoes, which are a great vector for disease, so people don't like that. So wetlands in the past maybe haven't gotten as much appreciation for what they do for us as they should. So the first thing that wetlands really are helpful with is water quality. So when it's raining outside and we've got all of this rainwater coming down and flowing over the impermeable surfaces that we have in developed areas like roads, parking lots, sidewalks, that water is picking up all of the nastiness from the ground. So some dog poop, the discarded French fries, the trash that people leave out. So this water is kind of picking up all the gunk as it flows away, and water naturally goes to the low point in the landscape. And generally that's where you're going to find a wetland, and wetlands act like nature's Brita filter. They are able to really, with all of this vegetation and the slow movement of water generally through wetland ecosystems, they're able to pull out a lot of that nastiness that that we don't want in our water. So there are a lot of wetland plants that bioaccumulate things like toxic metals, just any kind of garbage. Those plants will pull it right out of the soil and out of the water. Going hand in hand with that water quality is wetlands' ability to control flooding. So, like I said, water flows to these low points in our landscape. And when we have areas that have been covered with impermeable surfaces, oftentimes that water can't soak into the ground, and we see these flash flood events. So wetlands provide a place for this excess water to kind of pool up. You can also think of floodplains down a river channel. Oftentimes you've got wetland habitat on either side of those floodplains or on either side of that river channel. And that's going to provide a nice place for that water to settle in that's not someone's home or small business. Next, we've got recreation. I'm sure that we've got several duck hunters, several fishers who are listening right now. And chances are you've probably been in a wetland and used it for recreation of some sort. So one of the biggest wetlands conservation organizations, Ducks Unlimited, is strongly backed by people who use wetlands for recreation. So recreation is a huge component of wetland use for humans, and probably one of the most immediate things people think of when they think of wetlands. Next, we've got wildlife and plant habitat. So we're all aware that wildlife use wetlands, and that as we degrade our wetlands, as we fill our wetlands and drain them, we're losing critical habitat for wetland wildlife. So a lot of waterfowl use our wetlands, but we've also got fish, amphibians, all these guys who love wetlands and love to live in them, and these provide a critical habitat for them. Another thing that we see a lot of is rare plants. So wetlands are prone to plant invasion. So if we're not taking care of our wetlands properly, if we're not making sure we don't have massive amounts of nutrient runoff, we can see an invasion meltdown, and we see the loss of these rare plants that doesn't even have to do necessarily with wetlands being destroyed. And then finally, we've got carbon sequestration. And wetlands are fantastic at storing carbon. So we know carbon dioxide is one of the main contributors to global climate change. Plants in wetlands will take out that carbon from the atmosphere and store it in their tissues. The majority of plant tissue is carbon. Wetlands, we're going to go over here and talk about something different. Wetlands have very slow rates of decomposition. That has to do with the amount of water that's there. Things don't decompose as quickly in wet areas. So when you've got these wetland plants that are oftentimes really fast growers and really efficient at pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, when you have these guys and they die and they usually end up laying down on the ground, they're not going to decompose as quickly, which means that that carbon that they pulled from the atmosphere isn't going to re-enter the atmosphere for a very long time. And you see this with things like peat bogs, where we've got this super carbon-rich, nutrient-rich material that's just been stored for years and years because of this slow decomposition process that we can associate with wetlands. So this is just a few of the ecosystem services that wetlands offer. And they really are this irreplaceable resource. There are constructed wetlands, there are restored wetlands, but I think something that we have to consider is that wetlands that have been constructed aren't necessarily as functional as far as ecosystem services go as these natural wetlands. So protecting what we have is a huge component of wetland conservation. And thankfully, we do have federal, state, and sometimes local regulations that protect our wetlands. So who regulates these wetlands? We just discovered that they're an incredible resource, so obviously we're going to have to protect them. And the basis for wetland protection comes from sections 404 and 401 of the Clean Water Act. This was established in 1972, and this is really what forms the base for our wetland protections now. And the primary regulatory agencies that help to enforce this wetland protection are the US EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, along with the National Marine Fisheries Service. And then kind of the big boy in this is the Army Corps of Engineers. So the Army Corps of Engineers is the primary agency involved in the day-to-day processes that we associate with wetland delineations and wetland permitting. So the Army Corps of Engineers administers permits for if you have to do construction on a wetland. They either conduct or verify determinations of what we can legally classify as a wetland. They develop policy for wetland protection. And of course, they enforce that section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which is the federal protection section. So that's kind of the first part of the presentation. And what we established in this first part is that we can characterize wetlands by using hydrology, our hydric or saturated soils, and our hydrophytic vegetation. We also know that wetlands are critical habitats that perform a bunch of ecosystem services, and they're largely irreplaceable. And finally, we know that the Army Corps of Engineers is that primary regulatory agency that oversees wetlands and wetland delineations. So now the question, where do wetland delineators come in? Where does Copperhead Consulting come in? Is the next thing we need to address. So how do we do a wetland delineation? And what even is a wetland delineation? Wetland delineations are conducted so that we can establish kind of the size and place of a wetland for those federal, state, and local regulations. So they're necessary for any project that might interfere with waters of the US or cause disturbance to those waters. So if you imagine there's this beautiful parcel of land where some guy wants to build a Target. And that developer, before he even breaks ground on that project, needs to make sure that he's not interfering with any federally regulated waters, federally regulated wetlands, that he's not destroying habitats for rare or endangered species. And Oftentimes, the target developer isn't the guy who is really well versed in environmental law, environmental policy, or ecology. So he hires someone else to do that for him, in this case, an environmental consulting firm. And that's kind of where we come in. So this developer, this project owner is going to hire a firm that is comprised of a bunch of scientists. And in my case, since we're talking about wetlands, that firm has wetland scientists on the team. And we're going to begin that project of wetland delineation, or the process of wetland delineation. So before we ever go out in the field to start delineating wetlands, we do some initial work. We analyze things like aerial imagery, so Google Earth, Landsat imagery, all that good stuff. We also use national wetland inventory maps, and those are maps of known wetlands in the area. So those can often provide us some insight into the space we're looking at. We look at the soils that are present in the area, and we look again at that topography of an area. So we use all of this to create a map and to create kind of a game plan for when we go out in the field. We want to optimize our workflow, and we want to be as efficient as possible when we're going out to delineate these wetlands, because often they're huge sites. So you might remember, because I've said it 50 times now, we characterize a wetland by assessing that area's hydrology, vegetation, and soils. So you can imagine that when we're in the field, we conduct assessments of hydrology, vegetation, and soils. So the first thing we're going to look at, or not necessarily the first thing, but often the first thing you see when you go out to a wetland is the hydrology. So if you're walking around and you feel it's a little bit squishy under your boots, or you see a puddle, or maybe an ephemeral stream, that's a clue to us that maybe we should take a data point here. Maybe we should analyze if this specific area is a wetland habitat. So when we assess that hydrology, we ask ourselves several questions. The first thing is that soil saturated? So does it feel squishy under your boot? Or when you dig into the ground, is the soil actually wet to the touch? The next thing is groundwater. So do you see groundwater when you dig a hole? Oftentimes you'll dig a hole in a wetland and you'll see water come up to the surface almost immediately. So groundwater presence is a huge indicator. And then, like we were talking about earlier, that local topography. Am I standing on a hill slope? Is it likely that water is going to pool where I'm standing or saturate this area for an extended amount of time based on what the features of the landscape around you look like? So by asking ourselves these questions, we begin to understand how water moves through the area that we're standing in. Through that local area. And when I say local area, I am very specifically talking about like a 30-meter radius of where I'm standing. The next thing we're going to do is take a look at the soils. And to assess these soils, we have to dig a hole or take a soil core about 18 inches deep. And what we're going to do is look at all 18 inches of that soil and color and texture all that soil. So we have very specific colors and textures that we associate with soils, with hydric soils specifically. And we can determine if those soils are hydric or if those soils have been saturated for an extended period of time by using things like our Munsell soil chart and by analyzing the texture. So this Munsell soil chart is a nice little book, and you take that out of your field pack and you hold up a little chunk of soil to it and you look at the color and what color does it match the best in your Munsell soil book. And that provides just a standardized way for us to communicate about our soils. So if I go out and I say, okay, this looks like a 10YR54, then someone on the other side of the world who's never been to Kentucky can say, okay, I can see what color that soil is. And that helps them to understand if we're looking at soils that are hydric. The other thing we do is look at the texture of that soil. So is it sandy? Is it kind of greasy, which is something that we associate with wetlands? What's the texture like? And we can do that just by feeling the soil or by using a little hand lens to look at the actual particles in that soil. And then we're also going to conduct the vegetation assessment. And I've given these to you in order, but it's important to understand that when we go out in the field, it's not always going to happen in the order of hydrology, soil, vegetation. Maybe I look over to my right and I see some cattail, and that tells me I need to go check out that area for a wetland. It's not always the hydrology that draws me there. This doesn't necessarily have to happen in order. But the vegetation assessment is when we look at the vegetation in an area. So we take our data point, and that's usually where we're going to take our soil core, mark it on our GPS, and then from that data point, within a given radius of that data point, we're going to identify every species of vegetation. And once we've identified all the vegetation, we go into USDA plants and we look up the wetland indicator status for that vegetation. So the USDA has assigned what we call a wetland indicator status for most plants. And this status tells us how often any given plant occurs in a wetland by the region. So this ranges anywhere from obligate wetland to obligate upland. Our obligate wetland plants almost always occur in wetlands, and our obligate upland plants almost never occur in wetlands. So an example of an obligate wetland plant is this photo at the top here, that typha or cattail. And I'm sure most of you have seen this plant before. And if you think about where you've seen it, you've probably seen it in drainage ditches along the side of the road or along ponds or in areas that have standing water. And that makes sense because the USDA codes this as an obligate wetland plant. This guy loves saturated soil conditions, and when given the opportunity, will almost always occur in them. If you look to the right, though, we have a facultative upland species. This is our Juniperus virginiana, or eastern red cedar. And this guy usually occurs in non-wetlands or in upland habitats, but he can occur in wetlands. And again, when you think about where you see this plant, it makes sense. Driving down the highway, you see these guys on those rocky slopes a lot. And I don't imagine that those rocky slopes hold water for an extended amount of time. So this status helps us to understand the vegetative community in a given area. And if we have hydrophytic vegetation growing in an area, chances are that that area has been inundated with water for an extended amount of time. The next thing we're going to do is take an adjacent upland point. So this is just to confirm to ourselves and to the Army Corps of Engineers who's going to review this documentation that we understand the boundary of that wetland. So we take an upland, non-wetland point so that we can contrast the features of the two areas. So we want to make sure that in the area that we define as not wetland, we have non-hydric soils, we have upland vegetation, and we have a pretty dry hydrological regime. So once we have all of that data gathered, we go back to the office and we start generating our reports. So we use these Army Corps of Engineers data sheets that are pretty standardized. If you want to look them up because you love forms, you can Google them and fill out a form yourself. But these are open access. We fill out these forms and we put in all the information that we collected in the field. We compile all the photos we've taken in the field. We make maps of the area that we walked, and we write out the methods so that we can generate this final report. And depending on the size of the area we're delineating, it can be anywhere from 50 to upwards of 200 pages. So the size of these reports is largely dependent on the size of the area you're delineating. And that report's going to outline all of those wetlands that the delineators identified within a study site. and it provides this photographic and written evidence of wetland features. And that kind of ends the process of the wetland delineation per se. And that's all I have for you guys.